I'm Jay Faulkner. Welcome to the G Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the Gross Out Podcast. We're going to gross you out about details from how it really is like to work on open source software. And again, I'm kind of lucky here that I get to talk to folks who I've worked with pretty closely for quite some time. Jeremy Stanley and Clark Boylan are both here. Why don't you both tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you do, and maybe a little bit about OpenDev, who you're here representing. Clark, do you want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Clark Boylan. I am an administrator for the OpenDev software development Collaboratory, and kind of that's a mouthful, but essentially we build software development tools for open source projects, and we host them. And I'm one of the people that helps build that set of tooling that we then deploy and make available to projects that are interested in using it. Tools that we use include Gerrit, Zool, which is a CI tool that we help develop ourselves. There's Etherpad for collaborative editing. There's Jitsi Meet for video conferencing, and much more. And the whole idea is that we're building open source tools for open source projects to write the software, test the software, publish the software. And we consume those things ourselves, right? So we dog food all of that to develop the systems as well. That means all of the edits that we make go through the same code review system. They get tested in the same CI system before they're deployed into production. So we're not only developers of these services and tools, but we are using them ourselves alongside the folks building tools like OpenStack or Zool or Starling X on top of the system as well.
Jeremy Stanley. I too am one of the OpenDev Collaboratory systems administrators. I would probably clarify that a lot of the services that we're running are not developed directly by us. In a lot of cases, we are running other popular open source developer tools and services on resources that are donated to us by some very generous public cloud providers. We do develop a lot of integration, and we do develop some tools and utilities as well that jive with all of that. A big part of the philosophy behind the OpenDev Collaboratory, though, is that developing open source software should be doable entirely with open source tools and services. And so everything that we're running in OpenDev is itself open source. I would say another follow-on to Clark's point about dogfooding the services and developing our tools and integrations on top of our own services that we're running is that it also gives us the ability to test the services changes that we would make to configuration or to upgrade to new versions of software and so on entirely within the infrastructure that we provide as well. So we can deploy mock versions of all of our services and see how this upgrade or that configuration tweak would impact.
Okay. So usually after this, I would ask a question about the history of like each of you, what you've done in open source, but like I happen to know there's quite a rich history behind OpenDev itself. So maybe can we talk a little bit about how OpenDev got started and, maybe even some of the prehistory, because I think the idea sort of bubbled up before OpenDev was even a concept, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, before OpenStack even. A lot of the infrastructure folks who started work on the OpenStack project back in 2010 had previously been involved in other open source projects, MySQL, Drizzle, where there were a lot of paradigms and philosophies that were kind of inherited when we bootstrapped the OpenStack community.
Yeah, and in particular, the development of OpenStack kind of grew out of these pre-existing groups, and they were using Launchpad at the time, I believe, and back then, Launchpad didn't support Git, and there was a big desire to be able to use Git for version control within OpenStack. And so the question then became, well, how do we support that for OpenStack? And that landed us on Gerrit, self-hosting a Git code review system that still supported the philosophies that these folks coming out of Drizzle and MySQL and so on had been using to develop the software prior to their involvement in OpenStack.
We initially started out using Hudson to do a lot of the CI/CD. For those not familiar with it, you may have heard of Jenkins, which was effectively a fork of Hudson, which we switched to pretty early on. bootstrapping of all of the infrastructure. But over time, we started to run up against some limitations in its design and had to build a lot of new CI/CD project gating tools around the workflows that we felt were optimal for our community, but that weren't really well supported by Jenkins as an application.
And at the time, that was all kind of integration on top of Jenkins. So there was a job queue service that had a Jenkins plugin that we could inject, requests for jobs into, which then allowed us to run multiple Jenkins servers. So I think at one point we had 8 Jenkins servers all running CI jobs controlled by this overarching queue that was being input requests by Zool, which then kind of eventually grows on to be a standalone CI tool that doesn't rely on Jenkins or the plugins in Jenkins or anything like that. And that's kind of where we are today with the CI setup, is that it's all built around this tool called Zool that we've helped build, that originated within kind of the OpenStack project's needs for scaling up and building beyond what Jenkins was able to provide for us.
So can you help me paint the whole picture and connect the pieces together? Because we've been talking about Zool and Garrett and these other things, but I think there's going to be people listening who maybe aren't familiar with those. So can you maybe take me through the path that a patch would take through the OpenDev system for just an average one of your projects? If I wanted to contribute, what would that process look like?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Oh, okay. As anyone who's familiar with developing open source software in Git, probably familiar with having cloned the repository to their system, made some changes to some files, committed those changes. At that point, those changes would get pushed by the developer to the code review system. We're using Garrett code review. And so then that'll show up as a change in Garrett. Or possibly if they've developed a number of different commits that are dependent on each other, they may push up a sequence of changes into Garrett. And then we've got a fairly egalitarian approach within the projects that are hosted in OpenDev. They tend to not want to have individuals who are privileged to decide solely what goes into the software, but rather want to rely on collaborative consensus to determine if a change is good. So in addition to the CI/CD feedback that the author of the change would get from Zool, the project gating system, they would also get one or more different core reviewers for the project that they had pushed the change for, providing them with human feedback on things that could be improved or changed. And then, that developer could iterate by pushing up additional revisions to their changes to resolve the comments that were left either by the code review system or by human reviewers. And then eventually someone determines that, enough review has gone on that they're willing to provide a positive vote for the change. Someone else hopefully also reviews it positively. There seems to be consensus. One of them then decides that it's time to approve the change, and then it goes back through another battery of testing just to make sure that, test results are not stale and that things that have merged in the meantime aren't going to invalidate the earlier testing that was done on that change. And then if the testing all passes in the final run, then the change is merged to the Git repository centrally, where then people who are doing further development on the software are immediately consuming that change into their own local copies of the repository. And that's sort of our take on continuous integration, that changes that are being approved are continuously winding up back into the work copies that developers are developing on top of, so that there's as little divergence as possible, and we can provide a lot of coordination with limited number of choke points to improve the overall throughput for the development process. So
just maybe to restate, to make sure I understand how all the pieces connect. A developer will push a change up to Garrett code review. The CI system, which I think Zool is going to see that, run the test, vote on that. Very much how, if you're familiar with GitHub PR workflows, I think it would be, putting a comment on the change, saying if it passed, providing feedback. And then you sort of have this situation where if it gets revised, it reruns and things, but eventually someone will approve it and checkbox it. And instead of going into the repo immediately, it sort of is queued to retest and then only to merge after everything else that was queued merged and has passed test. Is that sort of an accurate representation?
Yeah, the key idea there being what we refer to as project gating, which is that basically only the CI system can decide that the change is able to merge and then perform that merging. Humans are merely providing feedback to the other humans in the process and also cues to the CI system that it's time to retest this and make sure that it can merge and then merge it if it can merge.
Yeah, and kind of an important piece of this is that it's largely automated based on the code review process itself. So as someone contributing code or as a code reviewer, you don't need to take specific actions to instruct the CI system to take a particular action. It's the CI system is sitting in the background listening to events that would occur naturally within a kind of code review workflow. And it's then deciding to take action based on those events. So, you push up code. Well, there's new code. Let's go test it. Oh, go test it. Someone provides a review saying, I think this code looks good. Well, then maybe let's go see if we can merge it. And so the idea is that the code review workflow is kind of working in tandem with the CI system rather than needing to micromanage the CI system as part of the code review process itself.
So one of the things that's interesting that I hear sometimes as an OpenStack contributor, especially bringing new people into the community, is they have this kind of overarching question of why. Like, especially if you're looking at the project from like a 2025 perspective, you sort of wonder why, there's this monolith of OpenDev that exists to provide these services when, it's safe to say that source code forges along with like CI runners these days are a fairly common hosted service. Is that something that's changed over the last 15 years, or what continues to motivate you to have this sort of separate thing from some of the big names out there?
Yeah, I would say back in 2010, when OpenStack started and the need for development tools for OpenStack, became a reality that the project had to face, that GitHub had started, I think, around 2008, maybe 2007. It was relatively new. I was using it at the time, and functionality-wise, it was pretty rudimentary, right? Like you could do a pull request, but there wasn't a lot of tooling around that. You couldn't easily integrate CI systems. You couldn't do kind of in-depth code review. If you asked someone to revise a pull request in GitHub and then they revised it and pushed up an update to that pull request, all of the old comments within that code review would get deleted. They were gone. And that doesn't, GitHub was a great tool. I used it myself, but it wasn't meeting the needs for a project like OpenStack, right? OpenStack wanted to preserve the history of code review you can today go look within OpenDev on our Garrett server and look at reviews that were left in 2010. And that includes the history for each change, right? It's not just the final state that ends up merging. It's the iterative process to get to something that people were happy with and comfortable with merging. So I think, looking at it from the 2010 perspective, there were definitely deficiencies that were trying to be addressed with, what tools are available in the system. And as I mentioned earlier, Launchpad was the tool that they had been using previously. And so they decided they couldn't use Launchpad anymore. And I think that was largely driven by the version control system that was supported by Launchpad, which was not Git. It was Bazaar.
Literally and figuratively.
And so back then it was definitely a needs-based decision, right? Like these tools don't exist unless we deploy them and build them ourselves. As time has gone on, systems like GitHub in particular, the big one that people know about, has definitely improved. If you update a pull request in the way that I described previously, it will not lose those comments anymore. But those are all relatively recent, compared to the history of OpenStack and then OpenDev.
And I would say that the state that GitHub has admirably achieved at this point is relative to what we had 10 years ago. So, it's not as if we stopped making improvements to our systems 10 years ago, but now on GitHub, you can do 2015 workflows that we had, but our 2025 workflows are still quite impossible on a platform like that.
And then I think, so it was very needs based when things started. Today, I think a lot of what drives the continuation of running these services is maybe more philosophical in two ways. One is the code review process itself is quite a bit different between Gerrit and, say, GitHub or GitLab. And part of that, it has to do with the way that the code review is structured. Within Gerrit, you code review individual commits. So the idea is that each commit is a logical change. We call them changes that is going to get reviewed and tested and merged. This has some good benefits. It highly encourages people to construct commits within the Git repo in a logical way. Like, it does force you to plan a little bit, to think about what the commits look like, rather than making a pull request that might pull in 100 commits of just, I don't want to say random content, but the idea is that each commit is curated, and then that has downstream benefits when you're consuming the source code. Things like being able to bisect, because we've tested each commit individually. In theory, you'll be able to bisect the code base much more reliably, rather than bisecting at merge points. You're bisecting commit by commit, and so when you have bugs, they should be easier to find, easier to debug and fix. But it also helps in the code review process itself. Because things are logically structured, kind of individual units, it helps code reviewers just get through the code, right? You're not wading through disjoint commits that maybe don't make sense to someone who isn't the person writing them. The individual who's writing the code change is kind of forced to write the commit, the change, in a way that will make sense to other people. We can't force that to happen, in every situation, right? But it's that the philosophy of code review within Gerrit kind of pushes people in that direction. So there's going to be definitely counterexamples where people might just push a commit up that says bug fix and edits 100 lines and someone let it in, right? We can't prevent that from happening. If the code reviewers are allowing it to happen, it's going to happen. But in theory, we're kind of avoiding it by creating a structure that pushes people in a direction that says, no, hey, let's have a detailed commit message, because that's front and center in the code review. Let's make the diff readable, because that's what code reviewers are going to see is the diff. Make sure that it passes testing, because the CI system is going to run tests against it. And all of that happens on a commit by commit basis.
Yeah, it's sort of crazy. As someone who's always, I've used a lot of different repositories, source code forges, whatever you want to call it, throughout my career. And it never occurred to me until now that Gerrit's the only one of them that I have any recollection of that puts the commit message literally right alongside. If you hit, to go next through the code and look at it file by file, the commit message is the first file you're shown. And that I think I'm realizing now that that's impacted my behaviors, just simply the way the UI is designed and puts that front and center, just as much as the fact that it's single commits. That's a neat little insight.
There is one other code review system that shares that, and that would be the Linux kernel mailing list. Because patches are treated as email messages on the mailing list, and so you start out with the title of your commit is the subject line, and your commit message is front and center before the diff that you have inlined in your email message. And really, I think that's probably the fundamental difference for me between Gerrit and one of the other popular code forges like GitLab or GitHub or any of those, is that Gerrit started out as a code review system, first and foremost. It was not a code browser, whereas most of the other forges started out as code browsers and then got code review functionality hacked on, bolted on, painted on, etc. Gerrit was actually based on earlier code review system called Writefield that was written by Guido van Rossum, the Python originator. Then it was originally in Python and then got redeveloped in Java afterward and renamed. But basically it has a long history of code review functionality rather than focusing on other aspects of being a code forge. And so that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of success integrating it into our forge, is that it doesn't try to be other things. And so we can basically mix and match tools that provide a good code browser, tools that provide good CI/CD, tools that provide good defect tracking and task management, code search, all those sorts of functionality can be integrated rather than being stuck with whatever the one system that you have decided to use is implementing itself.
There's almost like a fun symbolic parallel here, right? Because GitHub these days is operated by Microsoft, and it sort of is a more monolithic model. They try to, they get your source code work, your CI workflows, your code review and pull requests, your issues are all kind of built in. But like OpenDev has taken more of a Unix type of model where it seems like y'all tend to gravitate toward tools which do exactly one thing, that try to keep their scope down and do it extremely well. And that's pretty interesting how that models fairly well. But your comment about the Linux kernel mailing list makes me very, very glad that OpenStack started in 2010 and not 1997 or something. Because
yeah, well, and speaking of like GitHub and Microsoft, I think that's another big philosophical reason that we continue to do this is we think that free software development, open source software development needs free and open source tools to do that, right? Like, I think if we all kind of just gave up and said, well, we can just use GitHub, it's good enough, which to be fair, I mean, it is a great tool. I use it. Other people use it to great effect. But then we're giving up kind of that ability to bootstrap for yourselves and whether that's because you want to own the process from end to end, or maybe you've got regulatory requirements, or there's a lot of reasons that you might get into that. I don't think we really have any particular reason beyond the tools work differently and we subscribe to those differences, and we think it's good to continue to push people to be able to do this should there be actual strict requirements to need to do so.
I mean, philosophically, I prefer to use open source tools over proprietary tools, even if maybe the features aren't entirely there sometimes, or I might have to work a little harder to do something in an open source tool than in a proprietary alternative. But I feel like as a proponent, maybe evangelist for open source communities, that choosing open source over proprietary solutions is really it helps me be less hypocritical. Why should someone use the open source software I'm developing if there are proprietary alternatives for it? Why am I choosing to use a proprietary service or tool to develop that open source software when there are open source alternatives that I could be using? But I think in the case of the OpenDev Collaboratory, what we have is not only a suite of services that are running entirely on open source software, but also a feature set that you really just can't find in existing commercial opportunities.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because we talk about free and open source software, but free software might be free as in freedom. It's not necessarily free as in beer. And y'all did reference that we do have some folks who donate clouds to OpenDev or cloud resources to OpenDev. How else is it funded? Like, how do y'all pay your bills? Kind of like who do y'all work for exactly?
Yeah, so Jeremy and I both work for the Open Infra Foundation. We're staff at the foundation, and that foundation hosts projects like OpenStack, Zool, Starling X, Kata Containers, Airship, and so on. And so, one of the things that the foundation is doing is supporting the development work of those projects by providing developer tooling that Jeremy and I administer and develop on. And we have other folks helping do the maintenance and administration. It's not just the two of us. There's about 3-ish other folks that donate their time pretty consistently. And then anyone within our communities, because all of this is dog-fooded and built in the open on the same code review system, using the same CI system that our developers use, we highly encourage the folks that contribute to the projects consuming these tools, help us out. Like, if there's a bug in a system and you can go, fix a CSS bug or edit a Zool pipeline configuration, or, I'm trying to think of a recent one. There was a CAPTCHA issue in one of the services we run. And I was blunt. I basically said, I don't have time to fix this right now. Here's where I think you need to fix it. And like an hour later, we had a code review up and I was like, great, it's working. The system is working. People are finding the problems that bug them. And because it's open source, they can help us out and fix them. So yeah, it's kind of primarily, I would say there's like about 5 folks that are involved day to day. And then we highly encourage the rest of the community that's involved in using these tools to help us out, scratch their own itches with particular bug fixes or even adding features.
And you mentioned the donated cloud resources that we run all of this on. Extremely expensive proposition because it's a lot of servers and a lot of CI capacity in particular. Those are all actually being donated by open source clouds. Different public cloud providers running OpenStack cloud operating system, and so we're in some ways the OpenStack project is dogfooding itself because it is being developed on services that are running in OpenStack clouds.
I was lucky enough just to be an observer for this, but I remember something like a couple of years back where there was actually an active bug in an OpenStack project. I think it might have been Nova, but I'm not 100% sure. That was impacting CI, that we then took that as feedback and fixed the bug in our code and helped that person get deployed. I'm not misremembering, am I? That happened a couple of years ago?
It happens more often than you probably realize.
Okay.
And sometimes, the projects like Nova or whoever will say, oh yeah, we fixed that bug. And then it's a matter of us trying to, go get the clouds to upgrade and deploy the bug fixes. But yeah, we try to provide feedback kind of as a value proposition to the folks involved. We try to provide feedback to those cloud providers like, hey, we've noticed this bug. We then talk to Nova or Neutron, wherever the problem is, they say, here's the bug fix. And we can kind of help, not necessarily coordinate, but at least point people in the right direction to be like, hey, maybe we can make this better. And sometimes we just, we trip over unexpected behaviors or configuration problems. They're not necessarily bugs in the software, but in the way that things have been deployed. And because of how we consume the resources, we can be fairly aggressive about deploying a bunch of load all at once, tearing it all down. The public clouds find value in having that kind of exercise their own services. And we are fairly knowledgeable in how OpenStack works because we're kind of embedded within that community a little bit. And so, like we said, we can point people in the right direction, get things fixed, kind of improve things on both sides of the equation here.
Yeah, it's nice in like sort of an open source atmosphere where there's a lot of concern, especially in the last few months, about funding for open source and sustainability, that it seems like, the Open Infra Foundation, OpenStack, OpenDev, we found a nice little ecosystem of sort of feedback donation that's been sustained fairly well over a long period of time. So that's really impressive. And y'all been a big part of that. I'm pretty sure y'all been around OpenStack long enough. You probably answered some crazy question I had, 10 years ago when I was trying to get onboarded to Garrett for the first time. So I appreciate that a lot. Y'all have always been great folks to have around. I hope we work together a lot more in the future. But, we've talked about a lot of the good stuff. We talked about a lot of the cool stuff in OpenDev, but we all been around the block. We know that software development, running infrastructure, it's never a direct shot from point A to point B. There's bumps along the way. There's mountains you got to climb, obstacles you got to route around. So I was hoping that maybe each of you could share one of these stories, maybe gross out our audience with those dirty details about what happened and then how, you resolved that, because it's very important to me that anyone listening to this podcast can understand that there's no magic trick, right? This is a bunch of people who are toiling to keep things working. So do y'all maybe have something to contribute along those lines?
Go for it, Jeremy.
Gross. Cockroach DB, and that hasn't been open source for like 6 years now. But I guess that's what's gross to me is when licenses on open source projects get changed to something proprietary. I remember the first time that I had to deal with that was about 20 years ago. I was working as information security professional and relied daily on the Nessus network vulnerability scanner. It was great. GPL functionality, had a vibrant community of people developing plugins and rules and contributing fixes back to the code base. And then one day, the community found out that the person who had been entrusted with the trademark for the name had hired on some private developers to rip out anything that he didn't own copyright on and replace it and publish the next version under a proprietary license. That spurred our community on to basically fork the project. It changed names a few times, but still exists today, 20 years later, as a GPL open source network vulnerability scanner that's quite popular. I guess the key takeaway for me from that gross moment was that when the trademark owner went rogue and took the software proprietary, the community moved. They abandoned that project entirely and started their own fork. So and we've seen the same thing happen over and over again with particularly single vendor open source projects in more recent years.
Do you remember what the name of the open source security scanner what it's known by now?
Yeah. So it changed names. Initially, they called it GNessus to be the GNU fork of Nessus, and then I think there were some concerns that was too close in trademark. It became OpenVAS for many years, OpenVAS, and then somewhat recently it was renamed Greenbone Security Scanner. The key developers who were maintaining it formed a new company around continuing the maintenance of the utility.
Oh, cool. And we'll make sure to have a link to that in the description when we get there, when we get this posted. So that way people can go see, because you're right, it is interesting how the open source community, it kind of routes around errors like that. And we actually spoke with Julia a couple of episodes ago about the importance of foundations. And I think that's an important lesson in that direction of that. Sometimes it might seem weird to mix business and your technology like that, but it's a protective move to sort of protect the whole of the community from the bad actors of one individual or one corporation.
Yeah, and then for me, the thing that kind of occurred to me when you asked us to think about this is something that happened a lot more recently. But over the last few years, Docker Hub has kind of decided that they can't provide unlimited bandwidth to everyone on the planet, which I think is fair enough. Hosting a global registry of a bunch of fairly large objects that people are downloading constantly is I'm sure very pricey and not cheap to do. And so we figured, well, we'll move our images that we consume and use, that we build, or that we can host them on a different registry to kind of work around some of those limitations that Docker Hub was putting in place. And so actually I did this. We all of our services for the most part at this point run out of container images. We build, for a lot of services, we build our own container images. And I moved all of the publishing for those container images to Quay, which spelled E, but I think people pronounce it Quay. And I thought, great, we solved the problem. And then like a day later, I'm like, why is our testing not working? Well, it turns out our testing, which it speculatively tests pre-built images to make sure that everything works, it relies on being able to configure a mirror for your registry in the Docker daemon config. Well, there's a decade-old bug open. Well, there's actually several now, I think, but Docker has only ever supported this functionality for Docker Hub. If you have a registry that isn't Docker Hub, you cannot mirror it in the configuration for Docker daemon. And I assumed that this was all fine, it was working, and it wasn't until I'd completely moved everything over and then ran a test and was like, hey, this test didn't do what I expected it to do, figured that out, and was like, oh, there's a 10-year-old bug. I think it's from like December 2015, so maybe a 9-ish year old bug in Docker preventing this from happening. I guess there's a lot of complexity that goes into building software, deploying software. You can make assumptions, and sometimes it doesn't always go the way you expect. So I had to completely roll back. We're publishing back to Docker Hub so that our testing will do what we expect. And now we've kind of restarted the process of accomplishing this migration with first moving to Podman, because Podman will let you mirror any container registry, which allows us to configure our testing the way we need to do speculative testing of the images. And then once individual services get moved over to Podman, they can then have their images hosted on Quay, and then we don't lose out on the testing behavior that we're looking for. but yeah, it's just I just accepted that this was a thing that would work fine, and it wasn't until I did all the work and then went, oh, nope, I was wrong. And so yeah, I guess sometimes things are complex enough. You're never going to catch everything, right? Like there's always going to be a bug. There's always going to be some unexpected issue, and you just kind of have to roll with the punches and get through it.
Yeah, there's two fun things about that story to point out, though. Is Podman itself is another great example of sort of the open source community having to route around that sort of proprietary damage a little bit. And so I really thank both of you for your time. Both, honestly, my career probably wouldn't be where it was if it wasn't for OpenStack, and OpenStack wouldn't be where it was if it wasn't for the efforts of y'all too. So that's greatly appreciated. And this is sort of I was thinking about this when you were talking, Clark, is that trust is almost like a currency in open source, right? And you can often see maybe businesses that are newer to the open source community don't always understand that as well, and maybe sometimes accidentally squander that currency even when they've got a hold of a lot of it. It's actually sort of interesting because I feel like sometimes I'm on the other side of this coin. Like this podcast exists because G Research is, trying to gain trust in the open source community and be a good citizen. It's sort of an interesting counterexample, but to that end, I do thank G Research for letting me have this podcast, for letting us bring on folks, talk about open source software. G Research is hiring almost always in our offices in Dallas, Texas, and London, UK. I'll make sure to have a link to those vacancies in the description. We'll also have a link to OpenDev and any of the specific technologies talked about here in the description. Is there anything interesting that y'all would like to talk about or point anyone to before we close up?
I would say, like we kind of talked about, like we do things a little bit differently, and some of the reasons for that are historical, and some of them are philosophical reasons. But I would say, if you're interested in things like code review, CI, version control, I think we do some pretty interesting things that a lot of other folks, if they are doing them, they don't really talk about them. I think that's one of the things that kind of makes us unique over time, is that we've built this fairly large system in the open, and we're happy to talk about it, include people, learn about it, and so on. Whereas, you'd have to go work at some big company probably to do something similar, and they're not going to talk about it publicly, right? And so, if you are interested in these things, I would highly encourage you to come say hello, get involved. We'd love more help. There's always work to do, and so yeah, I think that's my pitch. Is that I genuinely think what we do is interesting and a little bit different, and so there's things to learn there, and we'd love the help.
And I would say that we didn't talk quite as much about the Zool project gating system as we did about Garrett and some other things, but really the history of OpenDev is very tightly intertwined with the history of Zool. And if you are interested in how we got to where we are, there's some good articles on the Zool blog that sort of outline a lot of the whys and whats of that.
Yeah, Zool itself is crazy capable software, and I'm going to be honest, I steered away from that a little bit because I think that might be justification for an entire episode of its own, because there's just so much depth there, so much history. And I mean, honestly, you talked about how OpenDev does things today that, GitHub used to not do, that they've sort of been chasing some of the features that y'all provided. I feel like Zool is still ahead of the pack for a lot of those things, where if you've got really complex distributed scenarios, Zool is going to do a great job. So I agree with that. And again, thank you very much for being here. This is the Gross Out Podcast. On behalf of Jeremy, Clark, myself, and all of the folks at Gross, we thank you for your time. And come back, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. It's really important for us at this point in our growth. If you can hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and tell your friends. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.